On a Tuesday morning in April of 1986, a 28-year-old woman named Callie Briggs walked into the Oak Haven diner with a rolled-up soil map under her arm, and the kind of quiet certainty that either belongs to a genius or a fool. And in Oak Haven, Kansas, in the spring of 1986, most people had already made up their minds which one she was. The diner smelled the way it always smelled: bacon grease and black coffee, and the particular exhaustion of people who had been watching their world shrink for 3 years running. 6 farms in the county had gone under since the fall of 1984. The Hendersons lost their place in October. The Purcell family sold off in January 240 acres. Their grandfather had broken from prairie sod. In 1911, gone to the bank in a single afternoon for less than the price of a decent tractor. The Wentworths held a dispersal auction in March and stood in the mud and watched strangers carry off everything they had built piece by piece, while the auctioneer kept his voice cheerful, and the bank representative stood by the fence in a clean coat that had never seen a field. That was 1986 in Garfield County. That was the world Callie Briggs walked back into when she drove her pickup truck down off Interstate 70 and turned onto the county road toward home. She had been at Iowa State for 6 years, a 4-year degree in agronomy, and then 2 more years working on her master's thesis, a detailed study of deep-root phytoremediation in compacted subsoil environments. Her professors called it promising work. Her thesis advisor called it genuinely important. The farming community of Oak Haven, Kansas called it exactly nothing, because none of them had read it. And even if they had, they were too busy trying to keep the lights on to care about what a young woman with a university degree thought about their dirt. She had come home in February because her father called her at 10 o'clock on a Thursday night and told her in the careful, flat voice he used when he was trying not to scare her that he had felt something wrong in his chest that afternoon while he was working on the combine, and that the doctor in Salina had used the words mild cardiac event and that everything was fine, but that maybe she ought to come home for a while. She drove 12 hours the next morning without stopping. Dale Briggs was 62 years old that February, though he looked older. He was a lean man, the kind of lean that comes from decades of physical labor rather than any deliberate effort. And he had his father's hands wide across the knuckles and permanently stained with the kind of ingrained dirt that no amount of washing fully removes. He had been running the Briggs farm since late 1985, when his father Luther had a stroke that came without warning one November morning and left him diminished in the ways that strokes leave men diminished, quieter and slower, and turned inward, spending his last months in the back bedroom in the house he had built, and then passing on a Sunday morning in February of 1986, with his boots beside the bed and his coffee cup still on the nightstand where he had put it the evening before. Dale had been 61 when he took over a man who had spent his whole adult life working land that would one day be his, and who found that inheriting it felt less like receiving something and more like being handed a weight he had always known was coming. He had inherited 320 acres in Garfield County, a quarter section of good bottomland along the creek, and another 160 of harder ground on the rise to the west, plus 60 acres of what the family had always called the Broken 60, a stretch of low ground on the south end of the property that had been farmed too hard for too long and had given up producing anything worth mentioning somewhere around 1974. The hard pan on the Broken 60 ran 3 feet deep in places. Dale had tried to work it twice in the first months after taking over, and both times the equipment had bounced off the compacted subsurface like it was striking concrete. He had left it alone after that. It sat there at the south end of the property, brown and silent and largely useless, collecting thistle and costing him property tax every year. The farm owed $2,300,000 to the Garfield County Agricultural Bank. That debt had been $2,100,000 when Luther signed the last refinancing papers, and it had grown in the months since because the interest rate on agricultural operating loans in 1986 was running between 18 and 20%, and because the price of corn had dropped from $3.40 a bushel in 1983 to $2.10 by late 1985, and because a man with a bad heart and a limited crew cannot always do everything at the exact right time. And in farming, timing is the difference between a profit and a loss in ways that no spreadsheet fully captures. Dennis Crail was the branch manager at the Garfield County Agricultural Bank. He was 52 years old, a compact man with carefully combed gray hair, and the kind of deliberate pleasantness that functions as a warning rather than a greeting. He had been calling Dale once a month for the better part of a year to discuss the account status, and his calls had recently begun to include the phrase foreclosure timeline, which he delivered in the same pleasant tone he used for everything else, as though the word had no particular weight. Harlan Voss was 58 and operated out of an office in Wichita, though he drove to Garfield County often enough that people recognized his truck. He ran a company called Voss Agricultural Holdings, which was not exactly a farming company, and not exactly a real estate company, and not exactly a debt collection operation, but which managed to function as all three simultaneously. He had purchased 4 of the 6 farms that had gone under in the county since 1984. He bought them at prices that were legal, but that bore no relationship to what those properties had been worth, before the interest rates went wrong and the grain prices collapsed. He was not a cruel man in any personal sense. He was a systematic one, which is its own kind of cruelty when the system is tilted in one direction. When Callie walked into the Oak Haven diner that Tuesday morning in April, Harlan Voss was sitting in the corner booth with a cup of coffee and a man in a suit who handled his legal paperwork. Voss had been in town the previous afternoon looking at the Purcell land which he already owned, but was considering subdividing. He had no particular opinion about Callie Briggs. She was the daughter of Dale Briggs, whose farm he expected to acquire within the year, and beyond that she did not register on his map of the county. Callie unrolled her soil map on the counter beside the coffee station and asked Roy Tibbs who owned the diner, and also served as an informal clearinghouse for county information, whether he had a minute. Roy had a minute. About 14 other people in the diner also had a minute, which is how it works in small towns, and particularly in diners where private conversations have never really existed. She told Roy in a voice that carried clearly to every table without her raising it that she was going to plant the Broken 60 in commercial oilseed sunflowers this spring, that the deep taproots of the Helianthus annuus variety she had sourced from a specialty seed supplier in Nebraska would penetrate the hardpan and begin breaking up the compacted subsoil, that the sunflowers would pull moisture and nutrients from below the hardpan nutrients that had been locked down there for 20 years, inaccessible to corn roots that could not reach them, that when the plants died, their root channels would remain open in the soil, creating pathways for water infiltration that would make the Broken 60 productive again the following year, and that the oilseed yield from 60 acres sold to the Kellner processing facility in Wichita would bring in enough to cover the bank's next scheduled payment and buy the farm another season. She said all of this the way she might explain a mechanical repair, clearly, without embellishment, with the kind of precision that comes from having thought something through very carefully over a long time. The diner was quiet for a moment. Then somebody at the counter laughed. Then a few more people laughed. Then Harlan Voss in the corner booth set down his coffee cup with a small, precise click and smiled at the man sitting across from him. A smile that contained no warmth and no contempt, but simply the recognition of a thing that was not going to change any outcome he cared about. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Bobby Earl Tuttle, who ran the Oak Haven Farm Supply and Seed, and who had known Callie since she was 9 years old, leaned back on his stool and said loud enough for the room that he had not realized they were in the flower business now in Garfield County. He said it in the friendly tone people use when they want to be cruel without being accountable for it. Callie rolled up her soil map. She folded the rubber band around it twice. She looked at Bobby Earl Tuttle for a moment with an expression that did not change. And then she looked at the room generally. And then she picked up her map and walked out. Outside, the April wind was coming hard off the flat ground to the northwest, carrying the smell of dry soil and the distant memory of moisture. She stood by her truck for a moment and looked down the main street of Oakhaven, which was 2 blocks long and had 3 empty storefronts that had been full when she left for college. The hardware store where she had bought bolts as a child was closed. The implement dealer who had sold her father his last combine was operating on reduced hours. The world she had grown up in was in the process of being digested by something large and impersonal. And the people inside the diner were laughing because laughing was easier than the alternative. She got in her truck and drove back to the farm. Her father was at the kitchen table when she came in, going through a stack of papers with the careful attention of a man who understands that every line matters but is no longer certain he has the energy to argue about it. He looked up when she came in. He read something in her face and did not ask her about it directly. She told him she was going to plant the broken 60. He was quiet for a while. He looked at the papers on the table, and then out the window at the yard, and then back at the papers. He said he did not know what the bank would say about it. She told him she knew exactly what the bank would say about it, and that it did not matter what the bank said, because she had found a federal program that changed the legal classification of what she was doing. He asked her what program. She told him she would explain it when she had the documentation in order. He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he is not entirely convinced, but has decided to allow the possibility. He went back to his papers. She went to the desk in the corner and opened her soil survey folder. The money question was immediate and concrete. She had $12,000 in a savings account, the accumulated remains of her graduate stipend, and the careful living she had done for 6 years in a university town where she had never spent money. She did not need to spend. $12,000 would buy the seed, the specialized planter modifications, the inoculant, and the soil preparation materials she needed for 60 acres. It would leave her with approximately $400 in reserve, which was not enough cushion to speak of. But it was what she had. She drove to Tuttle Farm Supply 2 days later to collect her seed order. She had called it in from Iowa State 3 weeks earlier, before she had even told her father she was coming home, because she had been thinking about the broken 60 since before Christmas. And she had known in the way that farmers know things before they have the language for it, that this was what needed to happen. Bobby Earl Tuttle had her order ready on the loading dock. He had arranged it so that 3 other men from the county were present when she arrived. He called them her birdseed when he slid the bags across the dock, and the 3 men smiled. She did not smile. She counted the bags, confirmed the variety and lot numbers against her invoice, loaded them into her truck bed without assistance, and drove back to the farm. She had expected the contempt. She had not expected it to make her hands shake slightly on the steering wheel on the way home. She gripped the wheel more firmly and let the shaking pass. The planning itself was 3 days of work that she had not fully prepared herself for in a physical sense, though she understood it completely, in an intellectual one. The broken 60 had not been turned in over a decade. The surface was a crust of pale, compacted earth that crumbled into dry powder where you stepped on it, but was rigid as packed clay an inch below. She had to add iron weights to the planter to force the disc blades into the ground, and even then the machine skipped and bounced across the surface in ways that required her to go back over sections twice. She planted deeper than standard protocol called for, 6 inches instead of 3, pushing the seed down past the worst of the surface desiccation to where there was still the faintest trace of residual moisture held in the soil structure. She set the planter for a spacing pattern she had calculated from her thesis data, wider than conventional corn spacing, allowing the sunflower taproots room to develop without competing with each other. In the upper soil layers, she drove the tractor from before first light to after dark for 3 days. Her father brought food out to the field at noon and left it on the fender without comment. On the second evening, he walked out to the edge of the broken 60 and stood there for a while watching her work. She waved from the cab. He raised his hand once and went back to the house. On the afternoon of the third day driving the last passes along the south edge of the field, she noticed that Harlan Voss had parked his truck on the county road that ran along the fence line. He was standing outside the truck with a pair of binoculars. He watched for perhaps 15 minutes, the binoculars up scanning the field in the methodical way a man scans something he expects to own. Then he got back in the truck and drove away without looking toward the farmhouse. She finished the last pass as the light was going out of the sky to the west. She climbed down from the tractor and stood at the edge of the field in the cooling air and looked at the 60 acres of bare brown earth she had just spent 3 days covering in seeds that most of the county thought were a waste of time and money she could not afford to waste. The field looked like nothing. That was the honest truth of it. It looked like bare ground in a county full of bare ground, unremarkable in every visible respect. What was happening 6 inches below the surface, invisible and unhurried, indifferent to the opinions of the county. The seeds did not know they were supposed to fail. They only knew one direction, and that direction was down. She drove back to the house and washed her face in the kitchen sink, and sat down at the table and wrote out her costs and her timeline on a yellow legal pad in the precise handwriting her mother had insisted on and her teachers had praised. She wrote until her father came to the kitchen doorway and told her it was after midnight. The sabotage happened on the night of the 8th day. She had planned the first irrigation for that evening. A single deep soaking to trigger the taproot dive she needed to push the seed's energy downward rather than sideways. The farm had a gravity-fed irrigation system that her grandfather Luther had built in the 1960s, drawing from the creek through a series of concrete headgates and buried PVC mainlines that distributed water across the property. The system was old but functional, maintained with the kind of ongoing attention that old systems require. She drove her four-wheeler out to the main pump house at 9 o'clock to open the south field valve. The valve handle turned without resistance, which was immediately wrong. She put her hand on the mainline pipe and felt nothing. She grabbed a wrench from the toolbox on the four-wheeler and tapped the pipe. The sound that came back was the hollow resonance of an empty vessel. She followed the main line south with a flashlight tracking the pipe along the dry creek bed for 240 yards until she found it. A 2-foot section of heavy-duty PVC had been cleanly removed. The cuts on both ends were straight and deliberate, made with a hacksaw or a pipe saw, the kind of tool a person brings to a job they have thought about in advance. The pipe section itself was gone. Whoever had done this had not just cut the line and left. They had taken the evidence with them. The water she needed was bleeding into the alkaline mud of the dry creek bottom, a quarter mile from her field. Her seeds had been in the ground for 8 days. In another 3 to 4 days, the soil moisture at 6-inch depth would drop below the threshold for reliable germination, and the seeds would fail without supplemental water. She had perhaps 72 hours before the damage became irreversible. She sat down in the creek bed beside the cut pipe ends with the flashlight in her hand and did not move for a while. The creek was dry. The sky above the creek bed was the particular deep black of rural Kansas in April, with more stars than the eye could process. Somewhere to the north, an owl was working the field edges. The cut pipe ends gleamed white in her flashlight beam, clean and precise. the work of someone who had done it deliberately and without hurry. She thought about who knew the layout of the irrigation system well enough to find the main line in the dark and cut it at the point of maximum damage. The answer to that question was not a long list. She did not tell her father that night. He was asleep when she came in. She sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning with the telephone and her address book, calling every equipment rental company within 50 miles until she found one in Salina that had a 5,000-gallon water tender truck available the next morning. The rental cost was $220 per day, plus the fuel and the commercial water fill rate at the municipal station. She put it on the last credit card she had with available balance. She drove to Salina at 5 the next morning, rented the truck, and spent the next 3 days driving back and forth between the Oak Haven Municipal Water Station and the Broken 60, running a jury-rigged boom sprayer she had fabricated from irrigation pipe and spray nozzles. She drove in first gear across the field rows, laying water down slowly and deeply, watching the surface of the pale earth darken with moisture in a way that she found physically satisfying, in the same way that watching a parched animal drink is satisfying. She did not sleep during those 3 days in any meaningful sense. She ate sandwiches her father left in the truck cab. She filled the tank and drove. The cost at the end of it was $400 more than she had planned to spend, which left her with a reserve so small it was effectively zero. She repaired the main line herself, using salvaged PVC and coupling connectors from the supply barn. The repair took 4 hours on a Sunday afternoon and held under pressure. She did not report the sabotage to the sheriff because she had no proof and because the sheriff in Garfield County in 1986 was a man whose election signs had appeared on Harlan Voss's land the previous fall, and she was not in a position to spend what limited credibility she had on a complaint she could not support with evidence. The frost warning came on the 15th night after planting. The meteorologist on the Salina radio station delivered it in the careful language of someone who has bad news and knows it, talking about an Arctic front descending from the Canadian plains and a hard freeze expected for 2 consecutive nights, with temperatures dropping to 28 or 29 degrees. Sunflower seedlings at the cotyledon stage, which was exactly what she had in the Broken 60, will die at sustained temperatures below 32 degrees. It is not a close call. It is not a matter of some plants surviving while others do not. A hard freeze at that stage kills the crop completely. She stood in the kitchen with the radio in her hand and felt the particular quality of panic that comes not from surprise, but from recognition. The understanding that a thing you feared was possible has now become a thing that is definitely happening, and that you have a limited number of hours to respond. She asked her father about the smudge pots. Luther Briggs had maintained a small peach orchard on the east side of the property from the 1950s through the early 1970s, and he had used oil-burning smudge pots to protect the blossoms from late spring frosts in the years when the timing was wrong. The pots were cast iron heavy and simple, designed to burn waste oil and produce dense black smoke that trapped radiant heat at ground level and raised the ambient temperature in the immediate area by 3 to 5 degrees. Luther had stopped using them when the peach orchard was pulled out in 1974. The pots had been in the back corner of the pole barn ever since, which meant they had been sitting there for 12 years, which meant they were rusty, and some of them had cracked lids, and none of them had been tested. There were 47 of them. 60 acres of sunflowers at standard spacing required a smoke blanket that, given the prevailing wind direction from the northwest, would need to cover the entire field with a dense insulating layer. 47 smudge pots was not enough. The coverage gap was about 1/3 of the field on the eastern edge. She did not have time to find more smudge pots. She and Dale dragged the pots out of the barn on the afternoon of the frost warning and loaded them in the truck bed in 3 loads. Dale worked without comment, carrying the pots with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who is aware of his heart and is choosing not to let awareness become paralysis. They drove the pots out to the broken 60 and placed them along the western and northern fence lines upwind of the field, spacing them at the intervals she had calculated to maximize smoke coverage. She needed fuel. She filled every pot she could with waste oil from the equipment shed, diesel from the farm fuel tank, and a mixture of damp straw and old motor oil that produced the thick black smoke she needed. For the eastern third of the field, the section the pots would not reach, she gathered broken pallets from behind the equipment shed, 3 old tractor tires from the scrap pile, and a cord of wet wood that Dale had stacked against the barn wall 2 years ago and never used. At midnight, the temperature fell through 34 degrees and kept dropping. She lit the first pot at 12:15. The flame took slowly, spitting and coughing in the cold air. And then the oil caught and the smoke began rising in a dense column that the northwest wind immediately flattened and drove south-southeast across the field. She moved down the line, lighting each pot with a propane torch, working against the wind, her eyes streaming from the smoke, her face and hands blackening within the first 20 minutes. Dale stayed with the eastern section, feeding the tire fires and the pallet stacks, building the smoke coverage she needed for the unprotected third of the field. She had not asked him to do this. He had simply positioned himself there when the pots were placed, understanding without being told where the gap was and what it required. The temperature dropped to 29 degrees at 2 in the morning. She ran the pot line for 4 hours, refueling the ones that were burning low, repositioning 2 that the wind had made ineffective, choking on smoke, and working by flashlight and the orange glow of the fires. At one point, she lost her footing on the frozen stubble between the rows and went down hard on her hands and knees in the dirt. She got up. She kept going. At 4:30, the temperature bottomed at 28 degrees and held there for 90 minutes. At 6 in the morning, the sky began to lighten in the east with the thin gray light of a cold, clear dawn. The temperature was back above 32. She walked to the eastern fence line and looked at the neighboring fields. The corn stubble on the Henderson place, which Voss now owned and had not yet planted, was covered in white frost that caught the early light like broken glass. The road margins were white. The top rail of the fence posts was white. She turned and looked at the broken 60. The smoke had cleared in the hour before dawn. The field was not white. The surface was dark with moisture from the condensation. The smoke blanket had generated and standing up from that dark surface in rows that she had driven into existence. Over 3 days of hard planting were the pale green cotyledons of 60 acres of sunflower seedlings, unhurt, upright, still alive. She stood at the fence line for a long moment. Her face was black. Her hands were black. She smelled of diesel and tire smoke. She was so tired that the world had taken on the flat, shadowless quality that extreme fatigue produces, where everything seems equally close and equally far at the same time. Dale walked up beside her. He smelled of smoke. His hands were black. He looked at the field in the early light and did not say anything for a while. He said she was a stubborn fool. He said it in the tone of a man who considers this a compliment. He said she was just like her grandfather. She did not answer because she was crying and did not want to make a sound. They drove back to the house in the truck with the heater on high, not talking, and she slept for 4 hours at the kitchen table with her head on her arms and her soil map crumpled under her cheek. The legal discovery happened at 11 o'clock on the night she woke from that sleep. She had been going through her grandfather Luther's papers since the second week after she came home, working through the boxes in the spare bedroom that Dale had not yet fully organized since Luther passed. There were 3 boxes of farm records, 2 boxes of personal correspondence, 1 box of what appeared to be random objects Luther had considered too important to throw away, but had never gotten around to filing. in the third farm records box at the bottom beneath a stack of equipment. Warranty cards that had long since expired. She found a manila envelope with her grandfather's handwriting on the outside. The handwriting said Federal and a number which was a program designation she did not immediately recognize. Inside the envelope was a 6-page document stamped and notarized and bearing the seal of the United States Department of Agriculture. It was a registration certificate for the Federal Soil Conservation and Land Remediation Program, signed in October of 1985 by Luther Briggs, 3 weeks before the stroke that would take the last of him, and countersigned by a USDA county agent whose name she did not know. She read the document twice. Then she read the relevant section a third time. The program had been established under a provision of the 1985 Farm Bill as an incentive for farmers to adopt soil conservation practices. Participating farms received a reduced interest rate on their operating loans in exchange for implementing approved soil remediation activities. The key clause, the one she read 3 times, and then sat very still. Thinking about for a long time, stated that any acreage under an approved biological soil remediation plan was classified as environmental intervention. Acreage and was explicitly exempted from the commercial crop performance requirements contained in standard agricultural operating loan covenants. She understood immediately what that meant. Dennis Crail's foreclosure action was based on Clause 4B of the Briggs Farm operating loan, which required that all actively farmed acreage produce insured commercial crops. The broken 60 under the plain language of this USDA registration document was not producing an insured commercial crop. It was conducting a federally recognized soil remediation activity. Crail's clause did not apply. The document in her hand meant that the legal basis for the foreclosure action was invalid. She set it down on the table and looked at it for a while longer. Then she went to the bedroom door and knocked twice, the way she had knocked since childhood when she needed her father for something important. Dale came to the door in his bathrobe, his face showing the particular concern of a parent woken at midnight by a child who has learned to wake him only when it matters. She told him to come to the kitchen. She told him to bring his reading glasses. She set the document on the table under the overhead light. She watched her father read it. She watched the moment when he understood what it said. The slight change in his posture, the way his shoulders settled differently. He did not speak for a long time. He set the document down carefully, the way a man handles something fragile, though the paper itself was perfectly sturdy. He asked her where she had found it. She told him. He nodded slowly. He said that Luther had mentioned a program in the fall of 1985, something about the windbreaks and the government, that he had been working on some paperwork before the stroke came, but that Dale had not known the details. She told him that the details specifically, the details in paragraph 4 on page 3, had just changed the legal situation with Dennis Crail's bank in a way that was going to require the right person to explain it correctly. She told him they needed Walter Pruitt. Dale was quiet at that. Walter Pruitt was 71 years old and had practiced agricultural law in Garfield County for 4 decades. He was also a man that Dale had argued with over a fence line dispute in 1976 and had never fully reconciled with the kind of minor rupture between neighbors that calcifies over a decade into something larger than its original cause. She told her father that the fence line was 10 years ago and that this was now, and that Walter Pruitt was the only person within 100 miles who knew agricultural law well enough to use what she had just found. Dale looked at the document again. He looked at his hands on the table. Then he said what he said when he had made up his mind about something so difficult. He said, "All right." Outside, the April wind had died. The broken 60 sat dark and cold in the moonless night. 60 acres of pale green seedlings alive in the frozen Kansas earth, holding on, digging down. doing exactly what they had been planted to do. The hard pan was still there. The debt was still there. The bank's deadline had not moved. Harlan Voss would be back on the county road with his binoculars when the weather turned warm. But in the light of the kitchen under the reading lamp that Luther Briggs had bought at a hardware store in 1959, and that was still burning reliably 27 years later, a manila envelope containing 6 pages of federal documentation sat on the table beside a woman who had not slept properly in 2 weeks, who had black grease under her fingernails and frost smoke in her hair, and who had just found the first piece of solid ground in a field that everyone else had already written off as dead. Walter Pruitt lived 3 miles outside of Oak Haven, on a gravel road that turned to mud in wet weather, and washboard in dry, in a white farmhouse that had not been painted since the Carter administration and did not appear to need it. He had practiced agricultural law in Garfield County for 4 decades. And in those 4 decades, he had seen approximately everything that could happen to a piece of land and the people trying to hold onto it. He drove a 1979 Ford F-150 with 240,000 miles on it, and a cracked dashboard that he had repaired with electrical tape at some point in the early 1980s, and not repaired again since. His office was in the front room of the farmhouse. 2 walls of law books and a desk that appeared to have been manufactured from the same era as the books. He listened to Callie without interrupting, which was not a courtesy he extended to everyone. He read the USDA document twice, holding it under his desk lamp with his reading glasses low on his nose. He set it down and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then he said that Luther Briggs had been a more careful man than most people knew. He explained what they needed to do with the clarity of someone who has long since stopped trying to impress people with complexity and has learned that plain language is more useful than elaborate language, particularly when the stakes are high and the time is short. He would draft a formal response to Dennis Crail's foreclosure notice, citing the 1985 USDA program registration and the exemption clause. He would file it with the county clerk and send a copy to the regional USDA office in Salina. Crail would have to respond, and responding would take time. And time was what the broken 60 needed. He asked how long until the sunflowers reached harvestable maturity. She said 90 days from planting, which put the harvest window in mid to late July. He said he could give her 60 days before the legal response required a formal hearing. He said that was tight. She said tight was what she had. He charged her $40 for the initial consultation, which was the same rate he had charged in 1974, and had not adjusted since on the grounds that farmers in Garfield County had not gotten proportionally richer since 1974, and he saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She drove home with the manila envelope on the seat beside her, and the particular feeling of someone who has found a handhold on a cliff face. Not safety, not the ground, just something to hold while she figured out the next move. May became June in the way that Kansas spring becomes Kansas summer, which is to say, abruptly without the gradual transition that the rest of the country imagines when it pictures seasonal change. The temperature went from 50 at night to 70 at night in the space of 2 weeks, and the sun acquired the flat white intensity of summer that bleaches the sky to the color of old bone by 10 in the morning. The winter wheat across the county was heading out. The corn in the fields that had been planted was a foot high and dark green, and making the ordinary promises that corn always makes before the summer heat shows what it actually intends to keep. The broken 60 was doing something but different. The sunflower seedlings that had survived the frost had spent May performing the invisible work that Callie had planted them to perform. The taproots had gone down, not sideways, not slowly, not reluctantly, straight down with the kind of biological urgency that deep-rooted plants bring to compacted soil, which is the urgency of something that knows it needs to get through a barrier before the window closes. By the end of May, She had dug a trench beside 3 separate plants at different points in the field and measured the root development kneeling in the dirt with a folding ruler and a notebook recording numbers that matched and in some cases exceeded what her thesis data had predicted. The main taproots had hit the hardpan layer, that 3-foot consolidated barrier of compacted clay and mineral deposit that had defeated every corn root that had ever attempted it. And instead of deflecting sideways the way shallow-rooted plants do, they had continued downward. The hardpan was cracking along the root paths. It was happening slowly and entirely out of sight. But it was happening. By mid-June, the plants were 4 feet tall and still climbing. The stalks were thick, the circumference of a man's thumb, and they moved with the wind in a way that corn does not. A more deliberate and substantial movement, like something that has decided it belongs where it is and is not easily moved. The field had gone from bare brown earth to a dense, vigorous green that stood out from the surrounding county in a way that people noticed from the road, without necessarily stopping to understand what they were looking at. Bobby Earl Tuttle drove past the broken 60 on a Wednesday afternoon in late June and slowed his truck. He looked at the field for a while without stopping. Then he drove on. He did not mention it to anyone for 3 days, and when he finally did, in the feed store with 2 other farmers present, he said it in the tone of a man reporting a weather event he does not fully understand something observable, but not yet interpreted. Harlan Voss came back to the fence line in the 2nd week of June. He did not bring the binoculars this time. He stood outside his truck with his arms crossed and looked at the field for a long time. He was there for 20 minutes. He did not look at the farmhouse. When he drove away, his tires threw gravel. Callie watched him from the kitchen window and understood what she was watching. Voss had spent 2 years building a story about the Briggs farm. A story that the land was failing, that Dale was failing, that the natural and inevitable outcome was consolidation, acquisition. The productive land absorbed into his holdings, and the marginal land left to the county for back taxes. That story required the broken 60 to be what it had always been, a 60-acre testament to soil exhaustion and failed farming. The broken 60 was now showing signs of becoming something else entirely, and that was a problem for a man whose business model depended on people believing that certain kinds of land could only be saved by certain kinds of money and machinery. 60 acres of sunflowers proving that a woman with a master's thesis and $12,000 could revive ground that everyone had written off was a direct challenge to every claim Harlan Voss made to every nervous farmer in the county when he sat down across from them at a kitchen table and explained that their situation was not going to improve on its own. The morning of July 9th started clear and hot, the way July mornings in Kansas start. When the weather means business, the sky a hard blue with no cloud in any direction, and the air already carrying its full weight of heat before 7 o'clock. Callie had been in the field since first light, walking the rows, checking the development of the seed heads, which were the size of saucers, and still in active development, the seed fill not yet complete, but progressing on the schedule she had calculated. She estimated 3 to 4 more weeks to peak maturity. The Kellner facility in Wichita had received her product specifications and confirmed that the oil content of the test samples she had sent in June met their premium grade threshold. The contract price she had negotiated was 14 cents per pound above the commodity floor, which projected against the yield. Per acre she was tracking produced a number that covered the next bank payment with enough margin to matter. She was in the northern section of the field, kneeling beside a plant and measuring the diameter of the developing seed head with a cloth tape when she heard the airplane. It was a low sound at first, the kind of engine sound that registers on the edge of awareness before the mind assigns it a category. Then it became louder and more directional, and she stood up and looked west toward the Voss Agricultural Holdings tract that ran along the western edge of the Briggs land 300 acres of contract soybeans that Voss had acquired the previous year and leased to a custom farming crew out of Pratt County. The crop duster was a bright yellow biplane, the kind that is designed to be visible from the ground for safety reasons, flying at perhaps 60 feet above the soybean canopy. It was moving along the western boundary of the Voss property, which was also the western boundary of the Broken 60. And beneath its wings the spray booms were running, laying down a chemical mist that the southwest wind of July 9th was lifting and carrying east. She knew immediately what it was. Not from the smell, which had not reached her yet, but from the geometry. A crop duster spraying along a fence line in a significant wind does not stay on one side of that fence line. The drift goes where the wind takes it. And the wind on July 9th was coming from the southwest at 12 to 15 miles an hour, which was directly toward the Broken 60, which was directly populated by broadleaf plants of the species Helianthus annuus, which is among the most dicamba-sensitive plant families in commercial agriculture. Dicamba is a broadleaf herbicide. The soybeans below the crop duster had been planted with a pre-emergence application already done in the spring, and the pilot had no business running those booms again in midsummer, certainly not along a fence line in a southwest wind. The sunflowers 60 feet downwind were not going to care about the reasons. They were going to die if enough of the mist reached them. She ran, not toward the fence line, toward the equipment shed where her father kept the Nikon camera he had bought in 1979 for the purpose of photographing equipment damage for insurance claims, and had used perhaps 4 times since. She ran because she understood that what was happening was illegal. Under EPA regulations, that spraying a volatile herbicide in winds exceeding 10 miles per hour in proximity to a neighboring crop was a clear violation, and that a violation without documentation was a complaint without standing, and a complaint without standing would get her exactly nowhere with the Garfield County Sheriff or anyone else who might theoretically be interested. The camera was on the shelf above the workbench. She grabbed it. She ran back out. Her father was standing in the yard between the house and the equipment shed. He had heard the airplane. He was looking west with his hand raised against the sun, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand. She told him to stay back from the field. She told him to go inside. She said it as she was already moving toward the barn roof, where a fixed ladder on the south wall gave access to the roof peak, which would put her high enough to get a clear sight line to the plane and its tail number. She climbed the ladder with the camera strap around her neck. The roof was hot under her hands. She got to the peak and braced herself against the ventilation housing at the ridge and brought the camera up. The crop duster was still working the fence line. She could see the spray booms clearly from the roof, and she could see the chemical mist coming off them and lifting in the wind and traveling east. She could smell it now, the sharp synthetic smell of agricultural chemistry on a hot day. She found the tail number in the frame and pressed the shutter. She advanced the film and pressed it again. She got 3 clear shots of the tail number 2 of the spray booms actively running one of the visible mist cloud above the fence line, with the Broken 60 in the foreground. Then she heard the sound from below. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound of someone sitting down heavily on gravel. Not the controlled sound of someone choosing to sit, but the sudden uncontrolled sound of someone whose legs have gone out from under them without permission. She knew it before she looked. She knew it the way you know certain things when someone you love is in the same space as a danger. You understood intellectually, but did not fully feel until this moment. She came down the ladder faster than was safe. Dale was on the ground beside the corner post of the yard fence, sitting with his back against the post and his legs in front of him. He was not unconscious. His eyes were open, but his face had the gray undertone that it had not had since February, and he was breathing in the shallow, deliberate way of a man managing his breath carefully, because the other kind of breathing is not available to him right now. He had been standing in the yard downwind of the field when the chemical cloud reached the property. She got to him and knelt beside him and put her hand on his face. His skin was cold and damp in the July heat. She asked him what he felt. He said his chest was tight. He said it in the calm voice he used for mechanical problems, the voice that meant the situation was serious. But that panic was not one of the available tools. She went inside and called the Salina Regional Medical Center. She came back out and sat beside him on the gravel and kept her hand on his arm and talked to him about nothing important about the field, about the plants, about the route measurements she had taken that morning, keeping her voice even and present, while in the background of her mind, she was aware of the chemical cloud still drifting east across the broken 60, and the spray booms on the yellow biplane still running, and the tail number she had photographed, and the contract in Wichita and the bank deadline, and Walter Pruitt's 60-day window, and all the moving parts of a situation that had just added a new and heavier element to the load. The ambulance came in 22 minutes. Dale walked to it under his own power, which she considered a promising sign, though she also knew it was consistent with his character, rather than necessarily with his condition. He told the paramedics that he was fine. One of the paramedics told him in a friendly way that fine was for them to determine. Dale allowed this. She rode with him to Salina. The emergency physician at Salina Regional was a woman in her 40s who moved through assessments with the brisk efficiency of someone who has learned that economy of motion saves more than effort. She said that Dale had experienced a chemical irritant exposure, that his lungs showed mild bronchospasm consistent with organochlorine inhalation, and that she wanted to keep him overnight for observation. She said she was not alarmed, but she said it in the tone that means I am keeping my alarm contained as a professional courtesy to the patient. Callie sat in the hallway outside the room they put Dale in and looked at the linoleum floor. The hallway of the Salina Regional Medical Center at 4 in the afternoon on a Tuesday in July smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. The overhead fluorescent lights produced a quality of illumination that flattened everything. Removed shadow made the world look equally flat and equally near in all directions. She sat in a plastic chair with the Nikon camera on her lap and the camera strap looped around her wrist and looked at the floor. She did not make plans. She did not run calculations. She did not think about the bank or Walter Pruitt or the tap routes or the contract price in Wichita. She sat in the plastic chair in the flat fluorescent light and did not think about any of that. Because for a few minutes in the ambulance, she had watched her father breathe in the careful, managed way of a man whose heart had already announced its limitations, and she had understood something about the cost of what she was doing that she had been successfully not understanding since February. The broken 60 was 60 acres of dead ground on the south end of the family property. It was also her father's legacy, and her grandfather's land, and the concrete expression of everything she had spent 6 years in university working toward. Those things were real and they mattered, but they were not her father. And her father was in a room at the end of this hallway breathing carefully, because he had been standing in the yard of his own farm when a man he had never personally wronged decided to gas his daughter's crop from an airplane. She sat with that for a while. After about an hour, Dale appeared in the doorway of the room. He was wearing the hospital gown with the dignity of a man who considers hospital gowns an administrative formality rather than a comment on his condition. He looked at her sitting in the plastic chair. He looked at the camera in her lap. He said her grandfather had sat in the equipment barn in 1983, thinking the same thing she was thinking right now. He said it quietly in the flat informational tone he used for facts he considered established. He said that Luther had gotten up. She looked at her father in the hospital gown in the doorway. She looked at the camera strap around her wrist. She thought about Luther Briggs sitting in that equipment barn in 1983, the worst year of the farm crisis, with the bank on one side and the weather on the other, and the question of whether the land was worth what it was costing. Sitting with that question, in the particular silence of a man alone with something he has not yet decided, Luther had gotten up, and 2 years later, with his hands not quite steady, and a stroke coming that he could not know was coming, he had sat down with a USDA county agent and signed 6 pages of federal documentation that his granddaughter would find under warranty cards in a cardboard box in the months after he was gone, and that would turn out to be exactly the instrument she needed. She told her father to go back to bed. She told him she had calls to make. The next morning, she drove back to the farm before Dale was discharged because there were things she needed to see. She walked the western edge of the broken 60 from the fence line inward. The 2 outer rows, the rows closest to the Voss property line, showed the characteristic damage of dicamba drift exposure. The leaves were cupped and twisted, the margins rolling downward and inward in the symptomatic response that the herbicide produces in sensitive broadleaf species. Some of the outer plants had begun to show epinesty in the younger leaves, the abnormal growth pattern that indicates systemic absorption. The outer 2 rows were damaged. In some sections, they were going to die. The remainder of the field was untouched. She walked the interior and understood why. The density of the canopy, which had reached full development in the weeks since the plants hit their stride, had created a physical barrier to the drifting spray. The outer rows had acted as a shield. The chemical mist had been intercepted and absorbed at the perimeter, and the plants behind that perimeter had been protected by the density of the crop itself. The very thing that made the Helianthus annuus effective at soil remediation. Its vigorous space-filling canopy development had also given the field a measure of protection against the attack. 58 of the 60 acres were intact. She went back to the house and got the developed film from the camera because she had stopped at the Rexall Pharmacy in Salina the previous evening and dropped the roll for 1 hour processing, and the prints were in her jacket pocket. She spread them on the kitchen table. The tail number was legible in 3 of the prints. The spray booms were visible and running in 2. The date stamp on the prints showed July 9th. She drove to Walter Pruitt's farmhouse and spread the photographs on his desk. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. Then he said that the EPA regulatory threshold for wind speed during dicamba application was 10 miles per hour, and that the weather records from the Salina airport for July 9th, which he could subpoena from the National Weather Service with a single phone call, would show sustained winds of 12 to 14 miles per hour from the southwest. He said that 3 clear photographs of registration numbers active spray booms and a neighboring crop field in the background, combined with documented chemical damage to that crop, combined with a weather record showing illegal application conditions, would constitute a legitimate EPA complaint and potentially a civil damages claim. He asked if her father was all right. She said he was being discharged that afternoon. Walter said good. He said there was another matter they needed to discuss, and he said it in the tone that means the other matter is the main matter. He said that a legal source he trusted had told him that Dennis Crail had contacted the Kansas Department of Agriculture's Compliance Division. He said that what this meant in practical terms was that Crail was no longer simply trying to foreclose under the loan covenant. He was building a second front, and the second front was regulatory rather than financial. She asked what that meant specifically. Walter said it meant she should be expecting a visitor. Curtis Monk arrived 11 days later on a Thursday morning with 2 state agricultural compliance officers and a sheaf of documents that he handled with the careful deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed this moment. He was 51 years old, thin in the way that suggests metabolism rather than exercise, with hair precisely parted. and a state agency windbreaker that was clean in a way that suggested it did not get worn in the field very often. He introduced himself as a senior export compliance inspector for the Kansas Department of Agriculture and presented credentials that were in order and legitimate. He told Callie and Dale, who was standing on the porch in his work clothes 2 days after being discharged from Salina Regional, that he was issuing a stop movement order and full quarantine on all biological inventory at the Briggs Farm facility, pending an environmental review. He said that the department had received a whistleblower report indicating that the phytoremediation strategy employed on the southern acreage had utilized aggressive deep taproots to penetrate subsoil zones that, according to historical geological records, had been treated with lead arsenate pesticide during the 1930s emergency locust response programs. He said that preliminary soil core samples taken by his team from adjacent county right-of-way showed arsenic concentrations exceeding safe food production thresholds. He said that if those concentrations had been bioaccumulated by the sunflower root systems and transferred to the seeds, the resulting oil would constitute a toxic product that could not legally enter the food supply. He said the quarantine would remain in effect while the state laboratory conducted a full mass spectrometry analysis of the silo contents. He said that analysis would take 6 to 8 weeks. She stood on the porch and watched his compliance officers walk to the 3 silos on the north side of the barn and begin applying bright red, tamper-evident quarantine tape to the discharge hatches of each one. The tape was the same red as a stop sign designed to be visible and to communicate finality, and it moved in the July wind against the steel sides of the silos in a way that she watched without blinking. She did the arithmetic without being asked to. The Kellner contract in Wichita expired in 21 days. The quarantine would take 6 to 8 weeks to resolve through standard channels, assuming it resolved at all. The bank payment that the harvest proceeds were supposed to cover was due in 30 days. Walter Pruitt's legal response to the foreclosure notice had bought time, but time inside the law's tolerance for delay, rather than time outside the bank's contractual rights. After Monk and his officers drove away, Dale sat down in the porch chair. He did not say anything. He looked at the red tape on the silos for a while. She recognized the look. It was the look of a man doing arithmetic he already knows the answer to. She went inside and called Walter Pruitt. Walter listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he said that lead arsenate from the 1930s was a real historical fact, that it had been used extensively across the Great Plains during the locust years, and that it did persist in certain soil profiles under certain conditions. He said this did not mean that Monk's claim was true. It meant that it was not immediately dismissible on its face, which was what made it effective as a tactic. He said that what they needed was independent analysis that they conducted under conditions that the other side could not influence. And he said that the only way to get that in a timeline that mattered was to go around the state laboratory system entirely. He said she should call Iowa State. She called Iowa State that evening, not the agronomy department, which was where her academic relationships lived, but the agricultural forensics program housed under the soil science extension, which was a smaller and less celebrated operation that did the kind of technical evidentiary work that was neither glamorous nor well-funded, but was occasionally exactly what a situation required. The contact she needed was a man named Dr. Russell Haas, who had been 3 years ahead of her in the program and was now running the extension lab. She had not spoken to him since her thesis defense. She explained the situation with the completeness and precision she brought to technical problems, including the arsenic claim, the timeline, the quarantine tape on the silos, and the 21 days remaining on the Wichita contract. He listened without interrupting, which suggested he understood the nature of what she was asking before she finished asking it. He said he could be in Oak Haven by Monday with a portable spectrometry unit and a sampling protocol that would produce defensible chain of custody documentation. He said the analysis would take 4 days after sampling. He said the results would either clear the silos or they would not, and that if they did not clear the silos, she needed to know that independently and immediately, rather than learning it 6 weeks later from a state agency. She thanked him. He said he was glad she called. He said the work she had described on the hard pan sounded like exactly what the thesis had been pointing toward. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the evening light. She thought about the irrigation mainline cut cleanly at the South Field Junction. She thought about the crop duster running its booms along the fence line in a southwest wind. She thought about Monk and his rehearsed delivery, and the quarantine tape, and the 6 to 8 week timeline. She thought about the chain of decisions that had led to each of these events, and what those decisions had in common, which was information. Specific operational information about the Briggs farm, the layout of the irrigation system, the wind patterns and spray windows, the exact seed variety and planting schedule, which was what would have been needed to calculate the timing and method of a contamination claim. She thought about who had that information. The seed variety and planting schedule were in the invoice she had received from the Nebraska supplier in March. The invoice had been on the kitchen table when she opened it. Her father had been at the table. She had been at the table. And Ray Briggsdale's younger brother had been at the table drinking coffee and talking about the Wentworth auction the way he had been stopping by the farmhouse 2 or 3 times a week since February. Ray was 57 years old and ran a cattle operation 5 miles down the county road, 180 acres, and 60 head. He had expanded the operation in 1984 by taking on additional pasture lease and adding cattle which had required financing, which had required a lender who was willing to do business with a small operator in a county where the agricultural credit markets were contracting. He had mentioned the expansion at a family dinner in the fall of 1984. He had not mentioned who his lender was. She thought about who in Garfield County was currently positioned to provide operating financing to a struggling cattle operation in exchange for considerations that were not formally documented. She needed to know if she was right before she did anything with what she was thinking. And she needed to know in a way that was conclusive, rather than circumstantial, because Ray was her father's brother, and she was not going to walk into that territory on a theory. She spent a day constructing the information she needed. She told Dale that evening while he was reading in the front room that she had been worried about the secondary irrigation pump on the North Ridge line, the one that served the upper pasture, because she had heard an irregular sound from it 2 days ago and had not had time to check it. She said if it was failing, they could lose the upper pasture water supply at a bad time. She said she was going to have Russell Haas look at it when he came up from Iowa State since he had some mechanical background. There was no secondary pump on the North Ridge. The upper pasture had not had an active irrigation supply since 1981. The pump housing that existed there was a rusted, disconnected piece of equipment that had not been operational in 5 years. This was a fact that anyone who had spent time on the Briggs farm over the past decade would know. She positioned herself at the equipment shed at 11 o'clock that night, in the dark, with the farm truck running cold and silent on the far side of the barn, where its profile would not be visible from the North Ridge access track. She had a flashlight with the lens taped to a pinhole. She had a camera. She waited 2 hours and 40 minutes before she saw headlights on the North Ridge track. The truck that came up the track was Ray's, a 1983 Chevy half-ton that she had ridden in 100 times, that she knew by sound and by the specific rattle of the tailgate latch that had needed repair for 3 years. It came slowly without the headlights of someone arriving openly. It stopped near the rusted pump housing, and a figure got out carrying a flashlight and something heavy in the other hand. She turned on the farm truck headlights. Ray froze in the full beam of the headlights. He was holding a pry bar. He was standing in front of a pump housing that had no operational significance. He was there because he had received information that the pump was critical, and he had come to destroy it. And now he was standing in 250 watts of light with a pry bar in his hand and nowhere to go. She drove the truck forward until it was 20 feet from him and stopped. She kept the headlights on. She got out and stood in front of the truck and looked at her uncle in the light. He set the pry bar down on the ground. He did not run. He did not try to explain immediately. He stood there for a moment with the light on his face, and she saw something in his expression that she had not expected, which was not cunning and not defiance, but something older and more painful than either. He told her that Harlan Voss held his mortgage. He said Voss had taken on the cattle operation financing in late 1984 through a private arrangement and had held the paper ever since, and that, when the situation with the Briggs farm developed this spring, Voss had come to Ray and told him what the arrangement was going to require. He said that Voss had not threatened him in any explicit way. He had simply explained the structure of their financial relationship and what it implied. She listened to all of it. She stood in front of the truck with the headlights behind her and listened to her uncle explain how he had cut the irrigation main line in April, how he had told Voss's operation manager the details of the seed variety and planting schedule, how he had told them about the irrigation system layout. He said it all in the flat voice of a man who has been carrying something and is relieved to put it down, even though putting it down in this particular place is its own kind of disaster. He said he had not wanted to do any of it. She looked at her uncle for a long time. She thought about her father in the hospital gown, in the doorway of the room in Salina. She thought about the red quarantine tape on the silos moving in the July wind. She thought about Dale reading Luther's USDA document at the kitchen table at midnight with his reading glasses on. She told Ray to go home. She said it quietly without anger, which was not the same as saying it without feeling. She said that she needed to think, and that he should not come back to the farm until she told him to. He picked up the pry bar and carried it to his truck. She watched him drive back down the North Ridge track with his taillights going away in the dark, and she stood there in the beam of her own headlights on the ridge above the farm until the sound of his engine was gone, and the only sound left was the wind moving through the summer dry grass around the pump housing and the distant settling sounds of the farmhouse 200 yards below. She turned off the headlights. She stood in the dark for a while on the North Ridge, looking at the outline of the broken 60 in the moonlight. Below 60 acres of sunflowers with their heavy heads bowed toward the earth. The seed fill still developing. The taproots still in the ground, still doing their slow, invisible work in the dark, the way they had been doing since April. She thought about what she had and what she needed, and what the distance was between those two things. She walked back down to the farmhouse without the flashlight, moving by memory across ground she had known since childhood, and she sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook and started writing down everything she knew and everything she still needed to know and what the gap between them was going to require. The 21-day clock was running. The quarantine tape was on the silos. Russell Haas was 4 days away, and Ray Briggs was driving home in the dark with something on him that was heavier than the pry bar he had laid back in his truck. The weight of a man who has finally told the truth to someone who needed to hear it and is only beginning to understand what telling the truth is going to cost him. Russell Haas arrived on a Monday morning in a 10-year-old Chevrolet Suburban with Iowa State extension plates and a portable mass spectrometry unit in a hard-shell case in the back that was worth more than the vehicle carrying it. He was 34 years old, thin and precise in his movements. The kind of person who calibrates instruments the way other people check their watches automatically and without thinking about it. He had driven down from Ames the previous day and stayed at the motel in Salina, and arrived at the Briggs farm at 7 in the morning with coffee in a thermos and a sampling protocol already written out on a legal pad. Callie met him in the driveway. He looked at the quarantine tape on the silos and at the broken 60 visible over the fence line, the heavy-headed sunflowers filling 60 acres, with the dense golden authority of a crop that has decided it belongs where it is. And he did not say anything immediately. He stood there for a moment taking it in, the way a scientist takes in field conditions, reading what is visible as a preliminary to finding what is not. He said it looked like the thesis had been right. She said the thesis had been right about most of it. Walter Pruitt had arranged the legal framework for the independent sampling through Judge Henry Alderman, who sat on the Garfield County District Court and who had been hearing agricultural cases in this part of Kansas since 1969. Walter had driven out to the judge's home on Sunday evening and sat on the porch and explained the situation with the clarity he brought to things he considered urgent. Judge Alderman was 67 years old and had grown up on a dryland wheat farm in Barton County and had spent 17 years watching the machinery of agricultural finance work on the families who came before his court. And he was not a man who required extensive explanation when the broad outlines of a situation were clear to him. He agreed to be present at the sampling in his capacity as a neutral court officer, which meant that the chain of custody for every sample taken would be documented under his signature and would therefore be admissible in any subsequent legal proceeding without challenge on procedural grounds. He arrived at the Briggs farm at 8 in the morning in his personal truck, wearing work clothes rather than anything that announced his office, and he shook hands with Callie and with Russell Haas and with Dale, who came out of the house in his boots and stood on the porch with his coffee and watched. Walter Pruitt was there as well in the F-150 with the cracked dashboard, carrying a legal notepad and a pen. The sampling took the better part of 2 days. Russell had designed the protocol around a systematic grid covering the entire 60 acres at 40-meter intervals, plus additional targeted samples at the locations that mattered most to the arsenic question. 53 samples in total, each one taken at 3 depths. Surface 12 inches and 36 inches. Using a hand auger that Russell operated himself with the careful, repetitive efficiency of someone who has done this several thousand times. Each sample was logged by grid coordinates that Russell read from the county plat survey map he had pinned to a clipboard. Each location triangulated from the section corner markers embedded in the fence lines, bagged and sealed, and labeled with a sequential number signed across the seal by both Russell and Judge Alderman. Callie walked the grid with them. She had been up since 4 in the morning both days, and by the afternoon of the second day, she was running on the particular compressed attention that comes when a person has reduced their life to a single problem and is applying everything they have to it. The field looked different from inside the rows than it did from the fence line. The canopy closed above her head at the center of the planting, and the light that came through was green and filtered, and smelled of the specific vegetative smell of sunflowers in high summer, which is dense and slightly resinous, and unlike the smell of any other crop. The taproots of the plants she walked past had done what she had planted them to do. She knew this without seeing them because she could see the surface evidence, the way the soil had changed texture in the rows over the course of the summer. The slight subsidence in places that indicated the soil structure below was opening up the increased moisture retention she had measured after the last rain, when the surrounding fields had shed water off their compacted surfaces, while the broken 60 had absorbed it. The hard pan was broken, not uniformly, not completely, but along 60 acres of root channels that would remain open in the soil after the plants died and decomposed through the winter into the organic material that would begin rebuilding the biological community below the surface. She had done what she said she would do. She had proved what her thesis had argued. Whether any of that would matter in the next 15 days depended entirely on what Russell's spectrometry unit found in 53 soil samples. They finished the sampling on Tuesday afternoon. Russell drove back to Salina to use the motel room as a base for the analysis because the portable spectrometry unit required a stable surface and a reliable power source, and the Briggs Farms electrical system, while functional, had the kind of intermittent fluctuations that older rural systems develop and that are entirely acceptable for general farm use, but are not acceptable when you are running analytical chemistry on samples that may be used in legal proceedings. He said he would call her Thursday morning with preliminary results. She spent Wednesday doing the work that the farm still required regardless of everything else, because crops and livestock do not suspend their needs during legal crises. She checked the remaining irrigation lines on the upper pasture. She serviced the combine in the equipment shed, going through the header adjustments and the cylinder speed settings she had calculated for sunflower harvest, which requires different parameters than grain crops, and which the Briggs combine had never been configured for. She worked in the shed from 7 in the morning until 8 at night with the doors open and the radio on, and the physical work of it, the known and finite work of preparing a machine for a specific task, was a kind of steadiness that she needed. Her father came to the shed at noon and at 6 and left food both times without saying much. On the second visit, he sat on an overturned bucket near the combine header and watched her work for a while. He asked her how confident she was in the soil results. She told him she was confident in Russell's analysis and in the chemistry. She said that what the samples would show was either what Curtis Monk had claimed or what she believed was true, and that there was no middle ground between those two outcomes. He asked her what she believed was true. She set down the wrench she was holding and told him. She told him about the groundwater flow direction which ran south to north under the Briggs property, which meant that any contamination from the 1930s surface applications would have migrated northward and away from the broken 60, rather than concentrating in the southern section. She told him that the arsenic isotopic signature in historical agricultural pesticides differs in specific measurable ways from the signature of modern industrial compounds, and that if Monk's samples were drawn from a source of contemporary industrial contamination rather than a historical pesticide deposit, that difference would be visible in the spectrometry data. She told him that the Voss equipment depot sat on the south side of the fence line directly adjacent to the drainage ditch that ran along the southern boundary of the Briggs property, and that the depot had been in operation since Voss acquired the land in 1984, and that industrial chemical operations produce waste streams, and that waste streams go somewhere. Dale listened to all of this without interrupting. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. He asked if Walter knew about the contamination theory. She said Walter knew enough of it to know what to ask for. He nodded. He finished his coffee and went back to the house. Russell called at 8:15 Thursday morning. She was in the kitchen with the coffee still hot when the phone rang. She picked it up on the first ring. He told her the preliminary results on the silo samples were complete. He said the sunflower seeds showed arsenic concentrations of less than 0.3 parts per million, which was below the threshold for concern and well below any food safety limit in any regulatory framework he was aware of. He said the oil content profile of the seeds was exceptional high oleic with a density and purity that he had not seen in standard commercial samples, which was consistent with her theory about the deep subsoil nutrient access. He said the seeds were clean. She said she understood. She asked about the soil. He said that was the part she needed to hear carefully. The soil cores from the interior of the broken 60 showed a normal distribution of trace heavy metals consistent with long cultivated agricultural land. In Kansas, nothing elevated, nothing anomalous. The cores from the northern and central sections of the field showed the improving biological activity that phytoremediation produces increased microbial indicators, better mineral availability in the upper profile. The roots had done exactly what she had said they would do. The cores from the southernmost grid, points the ones taken within 40 meters of the property boundary fence line, showed something different. Arsenic concentrations at those locations were elevated significantly so in 2 samples, and moderately so in 4 others. The concentrations were not at the catastrophic levels that Monk had described in his quarantine order, but they were real and they were measurable and they were in the south end of the field. Russell said he had checked the isotopic ratios on those samples as a matter of course, because the isotopic signature of arsenic compounds differs depending on their origin, whether they come from naturally occurring geological sources from historical agricultural applications or from contemporary industrial compounds. He said the isotopic profile of the elevated samples from the south end of the field was not consistent with lead arsenate from the 1930s. The isotopic ratios pointed to a modern industrial source, specifically the class of compounds used as defoliants and chemical rinse agents in large-scale agricultural machinery operations. He said the source of the contamination in the south end of the Broken 60 was not the Briggs farm. The groundwater flow direction and the isotopic profile both pointed to an external source to the south. She asked him if his documentation would support that conclusion in a legal context. He said that was why he had asked Judge Alderman to sign the chain of custody forms at every step, and that was why he had run the isotopic analysis as part of the standard protocol rather than as an afterthought, and that, yes, the documentation would support it. She thanked him. He said she should make sure Walter Pruitt understood the isotopic distinction clearly, because it was the difference between a contamination story and a falsified contamination story. And that difference was the one that mattered. She called Walter before she had finished her coffee. Walter listened to the summary. He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him writing on his legal pad. He asked her to read him the specific arsenic concentrations from the south grid samples and the interior samples so he could have them in the record before he did anything else. She read them off the notes she had taken during Russell's call. He said that what she had described was a situation in which Curtis Monk had taken samples from a location that was outside the Briggs property and was consistent with contamination from the Voss facility, had labeled those samples with Briggs farm coordinates, and had used them as the evidentiary basis for a quarantine order against inventory that was demonstrably clean. He said that was not an administrative error. He said the word he would use for it in a legal filing was fraud, and he said it in the tone of a man who uses the word deliberately and means it precisely. She asked him what they needed to do with what they had. He said they needed one more thing. He said that laboratory results showing the contamination was external and isotopically inconsistent with historical sources would support the claim. He said that a credible witness who could place Curtis Monk at the location where the samples were actually taken, rather than the location listed on the quarantine documentation, would close the case completely. She was quiet for a moment. He said he thought she might know who that witness was. Ray Briggs came to the farm on a Friday evening. He came in his truck, the same Chevy half-ton, but this time he came up the main driveway in the late afternoon light without concealment. And he parked in the yard and got out and stood by the truck without coming to the door, the way a man stands when he is not sure of his welcome and is not going to presume it. Dale was on the porch. He saw his brother in the yard. He looked at Ray for a long moment, and then he looked at his coffee cup, and then he looked back at Ray. He did not speak. Callie came out and stood beside her father. Ray looked at the silos with the red quarantine tape. He looked at the broken 60 over the fence line, the heavy heads bowed in the evening light. He looked at Dale on the porch. He did not look at Callie directly for a moment. He said he had been thinking since Tuesday night. He said he had not slept more than a few hours in the days since. He said that Harlan Voss had structured his debt in a way that Ray had not fully understood when he accepted the financing in 1984, in a way that made the options available to him feel very limited when Voss came to him in the spring and explained what the situation required. He said he understood that this was not an excuse. He said he was not asking for it to be treated as one. He said that on the night of July 17th, he had been in his truck on the county road near the Voss Equipment Depot because Voss had told him to be there to ensure that no one from the Briggs farm was in the area when Monk's team came. He said he had watched from the road as Monk's 2 officers got out of their state vehicle and walked not to the boundary of the Briggs property but to the drainage ditch on the Voss side of the fence line, and that they had taken samples from the ditch itself, from the discolored ground around the ditch where chemical runoff had been pooling and absorbing into the soil for 2 years. He said Monk had been directing them from beside the vehicle and had handed them the labeled sample bags before they started bags that already had Briggs Farm coordinate stickers on them. Callie asked if he would say all of that in front of Judge Alderman and sign it under oath. Ray looked at his brother on the porch. Dale was looking at him steadily without expression, the look of a man who is listening to something he needs to hear all the way through before he decides anything. Ray said yes. He said he would sign whatever Walter Pruitt put in front of him. He said that Voss would likely call his note when this was over, and that he understood what that meant for his operation. He said he had spent 4 days since Tuesday night thinking about his father Luther, sitting in this same farmyard, and what Luther would say if he could see what Ray had done with the name Luther had spent 40 years building a reputation in this county to protect, and that thinking about that was worse than whatever Voss was going to do to his cattle operation. He said he was sorry. He said it to Dale, not to Callie, because that was where the weight of it actually sat. Dale looked at his brother for a long time. He did not say anything. He got up from the porch chair and went inside. After a moment, the screen door swung closed behind him. Callie told Ray to come inside, and she would call Walter. Walter Pruitt came to the farm the next morning with a notary stamp and a witness affidavit form that he had drafted the previous evening. He sat at the kitchen table with Ray and went through the statement methodically, asking Ray to describe in precise sequential terms everything he had observed on the night of July 17th, from his arrival on the county road to his departure. He asked clarifying questions about distances and lighting conditions and the specific actions he had seen. He asked whether Ray had been close enough to see the pre-labeled sample bags clearly. Ray said yes, that he had been 20 feet from the vehicle at one point when he walked down the road shoulder to a better vantage point, and that the bags Monk handed to his officers had the yellow sticker labels he recognized from the state agricultural compliance forms. Walter wrote everything down. He read it back to Ray in full. He asked if there were any corrections. There were 2 small ones. He corrected them. He asked Ray to read the final version himself. Ray read it. He signed it. Walter stamped it. Dale sat at the counter during all of this with his coffee and did not speak. When Ray got up to leave, he stopped at the door and looked at his brother. Dale looked up from his coffee. Neither of them said anything, but Dale held Ray's eyes for a moment before Ray went out, and it was the kind of moment that does not require language, because language would reduce it. Walter stayed after Ray left. He spread his legal pad on the table and walked Callie through the package he was going to bring to Judge Alderman. The Russell Haas laboratory results with full chain of custody documentation. The isotopic analysis showing the external industrial source of the south boundary contamination. The groundwater flow data from the county geological survey showing the directional impossibility of the contamination originating from within the Briggs farm. The photographs of the crop duster with the tail registration number. and the active spray booms, and the documented wind speed records from the National Weather Service for July 9th, and Ray's sworn affidavit placing Monk at the contamination source and describing the pre-labeling of the sample bags. He said he was going to request an emergency hearing before Judge Alderman at the earliest available time, which he believed he could get that afternoon. Given the circumstances and given that the quarantine was causing ongoing irreparable financial harm to the farm, she asked what happened after the hearing. He said that depended on the judge. He said Henry Alderman had been doing this for a long time and was not a man who needed things explained twice. The hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon in the county courthouse, in the same building where Garfield County had been handling its civic business since 1908. The courtroom was small and smelled of old wood and the particular institutional cleanliness of a public building that has been cleaned regularly for 80 years. Judge Alderman came in without ceremony and sat down and asked Walter to present what he had. Walter presented it in 40 minutes. He was organized and precise, and he used the documents the way an experienced attorney uses documents as the foundation of an argument rather than the argument itself. He walked the judge through the laboratory results, the isotopic analysis, the groundwater data, and the affidavit. He explained the timeline of the quarantine order and the contract expiration and the financial consequences. He explained what he believed had occurred not as speculation, but as a conclusion supported by the evidence in front of the court. Dennis Crail was not present. Curtis Monk was not present. There was no attorney for the state present because Walter had not filed this as a contested proceeding, but as an emergency petition for relief, which did not require advance notice to the opposing parties under Kansas civil procedure rules when irreparable harm was being actively demonstrated. Judge Alderman read every document himself. He read the laboratory results twice. He studied the isotopic analysis. He read Ray's affidavit from beginning to end without looking up. He set it down and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way that judges look at ceilings when they are not uncertain about the outcome, but are being careful to be sure. He said that the evidence presented indicated that the quarantine order issued by Curtis Monk on July 21st was based on samples that were not taken from the Briggs Farm property, that the labeling of those samples with Briggs Farm coordinates was fraudulent, and that the inventory contained in the Briggs Farm silos was demonstrably free of contamination at any threshold relevant to the food safety concerns cited in the quarantine order. He said the quarantine was vacated effective immediately. He said he was referring the matter to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal conduct by a state official. He said he was also issuing a copy of his order to the Kansas Department of Agriculture's director. He signed the order. He gave the original to Walter and kept a copy for the court record. He stood up and left the courtroom. Walter drove back to the farm and handed Callie the judge's order across the kitchen table. It was a single page. She read it twice. She folded it once and held it in her hands. She called the Kellner facility in Wichita. The contracts manager there was a man she had been dealing with since June, a practical and direct person who had made clear throughout their dealings that he was interested in the oil and in the reliability of the supplier and in nothing else. She explained that the quarantine had been vacated by a county court order that morning, that the order was signed, and she could send a copy immediately, and that she was ready to schedule transport. He said he would have trucks there Tuesday morning. She called the credit union in Salina, where she had opened the farm account 3 weeks earlier, and confirmed that the contract funds would clear within 72 hours of the verified delivery wait. She called Walter back and told him the trucks were coming Tuesday. He said good. He said she should make sure Dale was rested. She said she would. The Kellner trucks came at 7 in the morning on Tuesday, 3 semi-trailers, with their company markings driving down the county road in the early light, and turning into the Briggs farm driveway in a way that Callie stood and watched from the porch. Because the sight of them was the first moment that the whole arc of the spring and summer felt like something with a direction, rather than a series of responses to emergencies. She and Dale opened the silos. They cut the red quarantine tape themselves, Callie using her pocket knife on each hatch, pulling the tape away in strips and dropping it on the ground. The tape had been on the silos for 16 days. She did not feel any particular ceremony about removing it. It was tape. The loading augers ran for 4 hours. The Kellner driver, a heavy-set man in his 50s named Hal, who had driven grain trucks since before Callie was born, walked the delivery with a practiced eye and confirmed the weight on each load against the contract specification. He said the seed quality was exceptional. He said it in the matter-of-fact way of a man who has seen a lot of grain and is reporting a fact rather than offering a compliment. Dale stood near the silos during the loading. He watched each auger run without talking much. When the third trailer pulled out of the driveway and the dust settled behind it, he put his hands in his pockets and looked at the empty silo hatches for a moment. He did not say anything. He went to the house and came back with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Callie, and they stood in the driveway and drank the coffee and watched the road. The credit union called Thursday morning. The funds had cleared. The full contract amount, which was $2,084,000, after the Kellner processing fee, was in the farm account. She wrote the check for the bank payment that afternoon. The amount covered the full overdue balance on the operating loan plus 3 months of scheduled payments forward, with a margin that gave the farm breathing room she had not had since she drove home in February. She drove to the Garfield County Agricultural Bank the next morning. She was wearing the clothes she wore to work in because she had been in the field since first light and had come in, washed her hands and face at the kitchen sink, and gotten in the truck. Her boots had dried mud on them from the morning. She had grease under 2 fingernails that had not come out completely. Dennis Crail was in his office. He looked up when she came in, and she watched his face perform the rapid series of adjustments that faces make when a situation has changed significantly since the last time 2 people were in a room together. He knew about the judge's order. It had been served to the bank by Walter Pruitt's office 2 days earlier. He knew about the referral to the Attorney General. He was a careful man in the way that people in his position learn to be careful, and he was currently in the process of understanding what careful meant going forward. She set the check on the desk in front of him. She did not explain it. The amount was on the face of it, and the account number was on the face of it, and the signature was on the face of it, and there was nothing that required explanation. He looked at the check. He looked at her. He looked at the check again. He said the bank valued their relationship with the Briggs operation. He said it with the smoothness of a man who has been trained to say things like this and who is currently aware that the smoothness is not landing the way it normally does. She told him that the remaining balance on the farm loan would be paid on schedule going forward, and that she would be switching the farm's operating accounts to the Salina Federal Credit Union, effective the following week, and that she wanted written confirmation of the payment posting and the current loan balance within 48 hours. She said all of this in the same tone she used when she was explaining a technical process to someone who needed to understand it without being condescended to. She was not angry. Anger was something she had used up on other things over the past several months, and what was left was something quieter and more durable than anger. She picked up her copy of the payment receipt which Crail's assistant had processed without needing to be asked, and she walked out of the Garfield County Agricultural Bank and got in her truck. She sat in the truck for a moment before starting the engine. The main street of Oak Haven was quiet in the late morning. The sky was the particular deep blue of late July in Kansas, a blue that has nothing tentative about it. A sky that commits fully to whatever it is doing. 2 blocks down, she could see the Oak Haven diner where she had stood on a Tuesday morning in April, with her soil map under her arm, and told the county what she was going to do, and the county had laughed. She started the truck and drove back to the farm. There were things to do in the days that followed. The sunflowers needed to be dished back into the soil rather than hauled off, because the decomposing root mass was the point, the organic material that would work through the winter in the channels. The taproots had opened and began rebuilding the biological life in the broken 60. She and Dale spent 2 days dissing the spent stalks back into the surface, working in the early morning before the heat came on fully. The smell of the cut stalks was sharp and green and particular, and it mixed with the smell of the turned earth in a way that she found herself stopping to notice at intervals, because the smell of turned earth in the broken 60 was different from what it had been in the spring. It had the dense, organic quality of soil that is alive, not the dry, chalky smell of the compacted ground she had planted into in April. The hardpan was cracking. She could see it along the root channels when she dug down with a spade, the fissures running through the consolidated layer, not broken through completely, but fractured and beginning to open. Next spring's planting would go into different ground than this spring's planting had encountered. It would not be easy ground, not yet, but it would be possible ground, and possible was everything compared to what it had been. Curtis Monk was placed on administrative leave by the Kansas Department of Agriculture 2 weeks after the judge's order. The Attorney General's investigation was ongoing, and Walter Pruitt had sources in the state capitol who told him that the investigation had expanded from Monk's conduct to the source of the whistleblower complaint that had triggered the quarantine, and that the financial relationships between certain parties and a Wichita-based agricultural holdings operation were being examined. Harlan Voss was not charged with anything in September. Investigations take the time they take, but he did not come back to the fence line with his binoculars. His truck was not seen on the county roads around the Briggs farm after the middle of August. Whether this was because he had moved his attention elsewhere, or because he had received legal advice about the risks of continued proximity to the situation, was not something Callie knew or spent time trying to determine. Ray came to the farm on a Sunday afternoon in August. Dale was on the porch. Ray parked in the driveway and got out and stood by the truck, the same posture as before, not presuming his welcome. But this time Dale got up from the porch chair and walked down the steps to the driveway, and the two brothers stood together in the August heat and talked for a while in the way that men who have known each other their whole lives talk when something important has happened, and neither of them wants to make more of it than it is or less of it than it is. Callie watched from inside the kitchen window. She did not go out. That conversation was not hers to be part of. She poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window and watched her father and her uncle standing in the driveway in the summer heat. And then she went back to the table where her soil maps were spread out for the following spring's planting. Ray came back twice more in the following weeks, and the second time he came, Dale asked him to stay for dinner, and he did. Nothing was fully repaired by this. The kind of thing that had happened between them did not fully repair. But it began, which was something different from nothing. And in Callie's experience, something different from nothing was usually the most you could realistically ask for as a starting position. In late September, she drove out to the broken 60 after the last of the disking was done, and the field was turned over and quiet, and she walked to the center of it and dug down with a hand spade in a place she had marked as a reference point at planting in April. She went down, carefully removing the soil in layers and setting it aside until she reached the depth where the hardpan had been at its worst. The taproot channel she found there was 1 inch in diameter and ran clean and straight downward through soil that was visibly different from what surrounded it. Darker, more crumbled, beginning to show the first signs of the microbial recovery that would accelerate through the winter and into the following spring. The root itself had died back and was beginning to decompose, which was what it was supposed to do, the organic matter breaking down slowly into the channel it had opened, feeding the soil biology it was leaving behind. She sat back on her heels and looked at the sample she had dug. She thought about the morning in April, when she had driven the last passes of the planting with the light going out of the sky and stood at the field edge looking at 60 acres of bare brown earth that contained nothing visible to recommend it. She thought about the night on the North Ridge with the headlights on Ray and the pry bar on the ground. She thought about the frost and her father standing in the tire smoke at 4 in the morning. She thought about the hospital corridor and the plastic chair, and her father in the doorway in the hospital gown, telling her that Luther had gotten up. She thought about Luther himself, the man she had known only in his last years with his large, deliberate hands and his specific opinions about soil management, who had sat in the equipment barn in 1983, with the farm crisis building around him, and made whatever decision it was that he had made, and then gotten up and then 2 years later had sat down with a government agent and signed 6 pages of federal documentation that would still be holding weight long after he was gone, filed carefully in a manila envelope under warranty cards, where the right person would eventually find it. The ground under her hands was soft, not the soft of loose sand or shallow topsoil, but the soft of earth that has been worked and is beginning to breathe again, the particular give of soil that has microbial life in it, and the structural capacity to hold water and to release it at the rate that roots need it. 60 acres of this. By spring, it would be deeper and more complete. By the following year, it would be productive ground. She filled in the hole she had dug and tamped the surface down with her palm. She stood up and drove back to the house. Dale was at the kitchen table with his papers, but fewer of them than there had been in February, and arranged differently without the quality of accumulated emergency that they had carried for months. The farm's account balance was no longer a number you kept yourself from looking at directly. The operating loan was current. The machinery was serviced and ready for winter storage. The broken 60 was turned over and beginning to do its slow, invisible work in preparation for what the ground would be capable of next spring. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her hands, which had soil on them from the digging. She told him the root channels in the south section were developing well. She told him that by next year's planting season, the hard pan in the central section would be fractured enough to run a standard corn planter through without modification. She said the eastern section would take one more season of remediation, a winter radish cover crop rather than another sunflower planting, and that she had already identified the variety and calculated the seeding rate. He listened to all of this. He nodded slowly, once the same nod she had seen in February when she had told him about the planting plan and he had decided to allow the possibility. He asked if she was staying. She looked at her father at the kitchen table in the house that his grandfather had built and that Luther had kept and that Dale had been trying to hold onto against a kind of pressure that was not personal and was not stoppable by individual effort, and that had been pressing on farm families in this part of the country since before she was born. She thought about Iowa State and her thesis, and the career that the thesis could have been a foundation for the research appointments, and the extension program positions, and the academic path that her advisor had been carefully keeping open for her since February. She told her father she was staying. He looked at his hands on the table. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said that Luther had told him something one time when Dale had asked his father whether he ever regretted staying with the land through the hard years. He said Luther had looked at him with the expression of a man who finds a question interesting rather than difficult, and had said that the land does not ask you whether you regret it. It only asks whether you are here. She sat down across from him at the table and put her hands flat on the wood, the same way she had pressed them into the soil of the broken 60 that afternoon. She did not feel triumphant. She felt like the ground under her boots had felt when she pressed her palms into it, broken open, full of air, finally ready to hold something again. Outside, the broken 60 was quiet in the September light turned over, and resting the taproot channels running down through the fractured hardpan into the subsoil below where the water was, where the minerals were, where everything that had been locked and inaccessible was slowly and visibly becoming available again. The field looked like bare ground. That was the honest truth of it. It looked like 60 acres of turned soil, in a county full of turned soil, unremarkable in every visible respect. What was happening below the surface in the dark, in the cold, in the slow, biological work of recovery that has no visible stage and no announced moment of completion, that happens entirely out of sight, until one spring morning you press both hands flat against the earth and feel something different under your palms, something that was not there before, something that took longer than you thought it would take and cost more than you thought it would cost and was worth exactly what it cost, and then a little more.